Hello and welcome to Money Life News and Views. I am Debashis Basu. Many people seem quite convinced that the Indian economy is growing so strongly that India is on track to becoming a developed nation. The untraveled bullish case is that we have shed the weaknesses of that were obvious until 2014, when an Indian economic renaissance has burst forth. Now, in this view, the steady gross domestic product growth of about 7% plus will transform India into a developed country, or as the slogan goes, Viksit Bharat. The definite signs of this, as they say right now, a low level of debt to GDP ratio, a low current account deficit, which is claimed to be heading towards a surplus, strong banking system, a well-managed budget deficit, and low inflation. Now, according to the minority camp to which I belong, these are questionable claims. A lot of positive factors may have temporarily created a favorable situation for India for now, but they only serve to hide the many continuing weaknesses that we suffer from. Besides, the data behind some of these claims and positives are questionable. Let's consider each one of these positives. There are 5 of them, right? Number 1, low debt to GDP ratio. While the government claims that India's debt to GDP ratio is low, according to World Bank and International Monetary Fund, India's debt to GDP ratio is above 82%. Now, is that figure very high or reasonable? Well, it's among the highest ever in India's history. The ratio rose continuously from low of 2014, hit a peak of 89% during COVID-19, and remained above 80% over the next few years. The last time the figure was above 80% was in 2004, and the peak of the previous 25 years was 83%. And that was in 2003, not too far from today's level of 82%. So low debt to GDP ratio is not exactly accurate. Current account. The current account is mainly financed by imports, exports, and financial flows. That is, financial flows from investors and also remittances from non-resident Indians. Imports are growing and are largely inelastic, which means we definitely need them, which are crude oil, electronics for all your cell phones, and gold. Exports are not growing fast enough. So exports as a percentage of GDP was 25% in 2013, which collapsed after 2015 and are now 22.8% of GDP. Not a great picture. According to official data between 2014-15 and 23-24, India's merchandise export grew from 310 billion in FY15 to 437 billion in FY24, which is a compounded annual growth rate of just 3.3%. Since this is far lower than inflation and the rupee has been weak, it shows how uncompetitive India's exports have remained. Meanwhile, imports were up by a CAGR of 4.67%. What saved the day was a third item in the current account, which is services export, which have grown by 8.92% over the same period. Now, the core of current account, therefore, which is merchandise trade, remains weak. Of course, the weakness is partly compensated by the fourth element, which is capital flows from foreign investors and remittances by NRIs. But here too, the numbers are not that strong. Contrary to popular belief, capital transfer rose from 65.7 billion in FY15 to 105.8 billion in FY24, a CAGR of just 5.58%. The current account deficit as a percentage of GDP has remained between 1 to 2% for the past 10 years, and there is no fundamental improvement. There cannot be a fundamental improvement without exports being much stronger. Third, banking system. We've cleaned it up. It's strong. It's one of the strongest in the world. The third significant improvement is, of course, the banking system. What this really means is that the public sector banks have cleaned up the balance sheets, since there was not much in the private sector to clean up, and they are very well regulated. Unfortunately, there's a huge difference between a one-time cleanup of balance sheet and a fundamental change in operations and management of public sector banks. Now, what's been surprising to me for the past 10 years is the continuing willful blindness about the single biggest reason for previous bad loans, which is unchecked corruption of bank officers in sanctioning loans and behest lending. Nothing has ever been done to make banks accountable. Indeed, officials of Reserve Bank of India, the Ministry of Finance, vigilance teams of banks, Central Vigilance Commission, and bank chairman have all blamed the problem on something else, which is two external factors. They are not to be blamed, external factors are to be blamed, which is genuine business failures. The environment turned weak, the businesses turned weak, they got hit by imports or whatever. And the second factor, poor bankruptcy laws. What have poor bankruptcy laws got to do with poor banking? But no, that was the logic. But now we know that the second reason is absolutely nonsense, because the IBC, which is the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, has shown us how wide and deep was such corrupt banking, as trillions of rupees have been written off without anyone having been made accountable for it. What is the evidence that this has changed in any way? Public sector bank reforms were initially tinkered with at what the PM called, what the government called Gyan Sangams, in which all kind of public sector chiefs and bureaucrats and the Prime Minister attended, and there would be sort of 2-day, 3-day sessions. A lot of new ideas were thrown up, which is all stopped now, which is because Gyan Sangams were not really useful, which I mentioned the first time they were conceived, which was about 10 years ago. Then there was Indradhanush, Bank Boards Bureau, recapitalization, and then finally bank mergers. Now, on bank mergers, as an ex-chairman of the public sector bank said to me, if you combine two small mess, you will only get a bigger mess. All the tinkering studiously avoided the one thing that needed to be done: set up an apparatus of accountability, which can happen through ownership change. I mean, there are other ways of doing it, but the simpler, easier one is ownership change. But then even the much discussed loan privatization of IDBI Bank has gone nowhere. Point number 4, which is supposed to be another great positive of India: budget deficit is controlled. India's deficit is one of the best managed in the world. India's budget deficit was 5.60% of GDP in FY24, which is higher than it was at any time between 2012 and 2019. Only in FY 2011 was the fiscal deficit higher at 5.91%. There is no fundamental change in the state's financial strength. The deficit figure continues to be controlled either by squeezing capital expenditure, which the Congress-led government did, or squeezing revenue expenditure, which the current regime is doing. There's not enough money to be spent on health and education, and budget deficit is controlled. Point number 5, the great fallacy of low inflation. Of the 3 reasons for the humiliating performance of BJP in the Lok Sabha elections a few months ago, one was high actual inflation, the other 2 being unemployment and lack of any real change in living conditions. Official inflation is low, but real inflation on the ground is not. The inflation number is different for different people. While as I said, official inflation is low, food inflation is almost in double digits. Also, inflation is low because oil prices are low, which India can't take any credit for. Now, what about the grand dream of Viksit Bharat or developed countries? Here is some data. Only 4 countries in the past 100-odd years have transformed themselves to a developed nation. None of them are in Asia. None of them are in Latin America. Europe and America were already developed. Right? So which are these 4 countries? These 4 countries are in the eastern part of Asia alone. Japan in the late 19th and early 20th century, Taiwan and Korea in the mid 20th century, and China in the 1990s. Such a radical transformation has 3 markers. If all of these countries have done all these 3 things to transform themselves, I'm not saying that is the formula, but that is, so far we know, is the formula that has worked for all of these 4 countries. One is farm sector reforms, which would lead to a high rural surplus. Large number of people live in rural areas. If you want a developed country, those people have to have surplus. They have to have money to spend. So we have two double-digit growth in manufacturing for years together, not 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, maybe 10 year, 15 or 20 years together. You have to have very high manufacturing growth, which requires a lot of things, including import of technology, training, and so on and so forth. I'm not getting into that. But if you see a number of years where India is recording double-digit industrial production growth, then you would know that something is working. It's not so far. 3, trade surplus from higher value-added products, which are the exports. Now, exports are pathetic. India has no competitive presence in exports. All of these 4 countries, whether it's China, Japan, Korea, or Taiwan, have all very strong export powerhouses. Now, my question is that we are nowhere in any of these 3 things, which is farm, which is industrial production, which is exports. Now, have we even taken the first step in our journey to any of these goals? Economic change that these countries have achieved requires a lot of focused and detailed work at the ground level for many years together, led by technocrats, and includes continuous course corrections, of course. We won't get everything right. You will get some things right and some things will wrong, and you have to quickly correct them. But this is a lot of many years of grinding work. All that cannot be substituted by sloganeering and chest thumping. I hope you liked what you heard today. Please spread the word by sharing and do subscribe. Thanks for watching.